Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk about the equilibrium model for biogeography. This model can be used to predict the number of species on habitat islands. The model was actually developed for oceanic islands, but it's very applicable to ecological islands in conservation biology. Two factors determine the number of species on an island. One is the immigration rate. That's the rate that species move from the mainland to colonize the island. The other factor is the extinction rate. And in this case, we're talking about local extinctions, extinctions that are specific to the island in question. This theory proposed that the number of species on any island reflects a balance between the rate which new species arrive on it, the immigration rate, and the rate at which populations of established species become extinct. So the equilibrium point is influenced by two factors, one of which is the size of the island, little tiny island like Santa Barbara Island, and then the other factor is the distance from the island to the mainland. Notice that Santa Cruz Island is closer to the mainland than San Nicolas Island. This graph shows the relationship between the immigration rate I and the number of species on the island S. Notice when there are no species on the island, this point here on the graph, the immigration rate is high. As the number of different species on the island increase, the immigration rate goes down. The immigration rate becomes zero at P. P is the pool of possible species that could get from the mainland to the island. To give you an example, let's assume there's 100 possible species of birds that can get from the mainland to the island. The pool of possible species starts at 100. Some species of birds would begin to immigrate across the gap and establish populations on the empty island. However, the rate at which new species could become established would decline, and that's what this line is showing. Once one species arrives on the empty island, the pool of possible new species that can arrive on the island is now 99. Once two species arrive on the island, the pool of possible species is 98. Thus, the rate that new species gets to the island declines as the island fills up. This graph shows the relationship between the extinction rate and the number of species on the island. Notice when there are no species on the island, the extinction rate is zero because there's nothing to go extinct. As the number of species on the island increases, the extinction rate increases because the extinction rate is related to the carrying capacity. And recall that the carrying capacity is the number of organisms the resources of the island can support. And again, these are local extinctions, just extinctions on the island. And so the extinction rate goes up as different species on the island are competing for resources. The point where look at the graph here, you have extinction and immigration. And the point where the immigration rate equals the extinction rate, right here where the two lines cross, is the equilibrium number of species for the island. And so if you look where the red line, which represents the extinction rates, and the black line, which represents the immigration rates, where these lines cross, that's the equilibrium number of species on the island. And that is represented by what I have here as S hat, the S with the little green cap over it. So let's look at this illustration that I've created for you. Here we have the mainland, which is the source for species that are going to get to the island. And here we have a small island and a large island that are basically the same distance from the mainland. Well, the immigration rate, the rate at which species arrive on the large island, is going to be greater than that for the small island, because a large island would be a bigger target. In addition, the equilibrium number of species on a large island is going to be higher than that for a small island. Remember the species area curve, where we plot the number of species as a function of area. And if you increase the area, you increase the number of species. And recall that there's two reasons for that. One is an increase in area results in an increase in habitat diversity. And the other thing is an increase in area results in larger population sizes. And larger populations are less likely to go extinct. And then we can look at the immigration rate on an island that would be near the mainland and compare that to an island that's far from the mainland. And again, the mainland is a source for species that are going to get to the island. And so you would expect the immigration rate for an island that's close to the mainland to be higher than the immigration rate for an island that's distant from the mainland, because it's going to be easier to get to that island that's close to the mainland. And so we can graph that, or look at a graph at that relationship, where we plot the immigration rate as a function of the number of species on the island. And we look at the difference between near and far islands. And so as we've said before, the immigration rate is going to be high if there's no species on the island, because any species that arrives on the island is going to be a new species. But the immigration rate for an island that is close to the mainland, a near island, is going to be higher than the immigration rate for an island that is distant or far from the mainland. And again, we can look at the immigration rate for small and large islands. A small island is a smaller target. A large island is a bigger target. These two islands being the same distance from the mainland, you would expect, since the large island is a bigger target, it would have a higher immigration rate. Then we can look at the extinction rate as a function of island size. And we would expect small islands, well, if there's no species on the island, there's nothing to go extinct. That as the number of species on the island increases, the extinction rate goes up. But as we'd expect, small islands would have larger extinction rates than large islands. And so if we put it all together, here we have a small island that is close to the mainland. Here we have a large island that is close to the mainland. And then here we have a large and small island that is distant from the mainland. The large island closer to the mainland is a bigger target, and you would expect the highest immigration rate on this large island. The small island, which is far from the mainland, it's going to be harder to get to that island because it's a greater distance, and it's a smaller target. And so we can combine all the graphs into this graph here that compares immigration and extinction rates for small and large islands that are near and distant to the mainland, and we compare those equilibrium numbers of species. And so this represents the equilibrium number of species for a distant or far small island. This represents the equilibrium number of species for an island that is near to the mainland and large. And notice that the near large island has a higher equilibrium number of species than the far small island, which is just what we would expect logically. And so what are the predictions of the model? Well, once equilibrium is reached, the number of species will tend to remain constant over time. Even though the number of species remains constant, the species composition varies. The number of species remains constant, but some species will go extinct and other species will arrive on the island. That change in species composition is called the turnover rate, and that turnover rate is inversely proportional to the area of the island. So let's think about what we've been looking at. I'd like you to hit the pause button, look at Santa Barbara Island, look at Catalina Island. Which island would you expect to have a higher equilibrium number of species, and why? So hit the pause button and see if you can come up with an answer to that. So let's look at some real data. Here you see Santa Barbara Island, okay, and here you see Santa Cruz Island. And Santa Barbara Island, compared to Santa Cruz, is a small, distant island. Santa Cruz Island is a large, near island. And if we look at the actual data for the number of bird species, Santa Barbara has 6 species of birds, and Santa Cruz Island has 37 species of birds. So the distant small island with 6 species has significantly less bird species than Santa Cruz, which is a near large island. Well, why are we covering this in the class? The equilibrium model is very applicable to conservation biology because it can be applied to habitat islands or ecological islands, like you see in this picture. Here we have an island of tropical forest surrounded by a sea of cattle pasture. Here we have another larger island of tropical forest surrounded by a sea of cattle pasture, and you can use this model to make predictions as to the number of species you would expect to find on these islands. Okay. Because remember, parks and reserves are ecological islands, and development leads to fragmentation and creates ecological islands.